I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, continuing response to the murderous attack on a Chabad synagogue, which took the life of an amazing woman, Lori Gilbert-Kaye, who sanctified her life to protect her rabbi from being murdered by a crazed and hate-filled 19-year-old. This is an assault on our family. Every murder, every shooting, be it in a church or a mosque or a gay bar or at some rock concert or a softball field or some office somewhere or a school, it's horrific. It taints our society and American culture. It cries out that as a society, we have not yet addressed the serious problem of the mentally ill. And the mentally ill are vulnerable to be influenced by those who preach hate and point to others as the cause of their pain and their problems. And so they feel encouraged, even bizarrely entitled to violence and murder by the outrageous, racist statements they sometimes hear and often read now on the internet or social media, a misnomer if there ever was one. Someone should start calling it for what it is anti-social media that exacerbates division and widens distance between people. And sometimes this irrational, sick hatred is directed at Jews. And sometimes it even results in a heart-searing, satanic murder of a Jew. We Jews are not being singled out. We are but one of a host of targets, of minorities, who are victims of violent attacks, most often with words, but now too often by deed, and even by murder. But when the attack is on one's own family, the hurt and the pain is overwhelming. And it's frightening. And it's especially frightening to our family because it evokes images of the most unspeakable, unimaginable, inhuman, organized institutional mass murder ever perpetrated on other human beings. Genocide, a word that had to be invented to describe what a country gone mad was doing to other children, women, and men. Every death by murder is tragic and senseless. But in Nazi Germany, the Jew was the victim of a sadism beyond human comprehension. And our family lost 6 million precious souls. We memorialize every one of those 6 million on Yom HaShoah this week, this coming week, Wednesday night and Thursday. We attend Yom HaShoah commemorations because we cannot do more and we will never do less. So when a 19-year-old kid, however mentally ill he may be, goes into a synagogue in Poway and murders, when a man enters Pittsburgh, a Pittsburgh synagogue, and murders, it evokes images that still seem like yesterday, the worst images imaginable. And it's wholly understandable why American Jews feel so threatened as a people, as a family. We don't want America to be like all the other places where Jews were welcomed and prospered for a time, only for a time. But this is the fear. Many people writing me these past few days have expressed this exact fear, that America will turn out to be no different than enlightened 20th century Germany. I don't see it. I don't see America or the American people the least bit anti-Semitic. To the contrary, I see the non-Jewish community of America, Christians, Muslims, secularists, gathering in a wall of solidarity around us, outraged themselves for the pain our family is having to endure for a second time in 6 months. Just as we, the American Jewish community, joined in solidarity with other Americans when it was a gay bar or a black church that was being assaulted. Understand, I agree with David Harris, with Malcolm Hoenlein, with the ADL, with every voice condemning hatred in general and anti-Semitism specifically. I am appalled that the grown-ups of the Democratic Party have not come down like a ton of bricks on Ilhan Omar. It's disgraceful. It's an act of feckless cowardice that she is still a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. If she'd made similar comments about Muslims or African Americans, she would have been forced to resign from Congress itself. And I'm outraged that the leaders in the halls of academia, those who head our colleges and universities, have tolerated a hateful BDS movement. And the most immoral organization on the planet Earth today, SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, who call for the eradication of a nation state of the United Nations. It is outrageous that SJP will be receiving a Presidential Service Award at NYU. NYU. Are they out of their minds? NYU and the president, Andrew Hamilton, is going to reward an organization which wants to destroy Israel and preaches hatred and tramples on free speech. Let alone the cartoons in the New York Times. The real danger facing American Jewry and America as a whole is not from crazed individuals who do despicable acts of violence and murder. It's from a democratic leadership that is cowed into permitting hate to fill its own ranks in the United States Congress. And it's from a misguided, warped sense of liberalism in the halls of academia that permits hate-filled anti-Semitic professors and student groups like SJP to go unchallenged and unchecked on American campuses. This is the true locus of serious anti-Semitism in America today. And as much as we mourn the loss of Lori Gilbert-Kaye, as much as we pour our hearts out to the Jewish community of Poway, as we did 6 months ago for the Jewish community of Pittsburgh, and as we do time and time again for the people of Israel, who experience a similar excruciating loss time and time again. And as much as we will decry every anti-Semitic act in America and be more vigilant and take more precautions and do everything we can to fight hatred and racism and bigotry wherever and whenever it expresses itself in this country, we will not, as a people, as a family, lose perspective on America or American society or the American people of which we are included. And we will direct our best efforts to the two real great threats directed at the Jewish community today: the failures in Congress and in our academic institutions to put an end to the hatred and incitement that is corrupting them both at this moment in time. There are many most thoughtful and articulate people in the Jewish community expressing their perspective in the aftermath of Poway. One is a major American Jewish activist, philanthropist. He's the founder of Signature Bank and an author of a marvelous book, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, which we featured in a marvelous conversation on L'chaim. His name is Scott Shay, and Scott Shay has been kind enough to join us to share his reaction and perspective to the murder at the Chabad synagogue in Poway. Scott, thank you so much for joining us again on JBS.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thank you.
So Scott, how did you first respond when you heard of the attack on the Chabad synagogue, and what's it all mean to you?
Well, Mark, as you know, I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. So whenever I see these sorts of images, they pierce straight to my heart. They pierce straight to my soul. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking a lot about this, though, and I do think that what is most worrisome here is not just the attack itself, but what it more than symbolizes, what it actualizes. You know, we're always, anti-Semitism and Jews are called the canary in the coal mine. We've talked about that.
Yes.
Why is that? And I'd like to step back and to abstract for just a moment about what's going on in our society and then bring it straight to the recent attack at the Chabad house just outside of San Diego. And that's this. And this is what's most often overlooked. And it's a lesson from the Bible, which is that this attack was about idolatry. Let me tell you what that means. We sort of think of idolatry just after Passover, as bowing down to statues and the like. But in reality, what we learn in the Passover story is that idolatry is something much, much worse. It's a set of lies about power. It's ascribing super authority or superpower to finite beings, people, natural processes. It's how Pharaoh portrayed himself as a god who could summon dragons to attack the Hittites in Kadesh or other places. And lies about power are extremely, extremely dangerous. The reason I think fundamentally that Jews are targets is because in a certain kind of way we symbolize the Bible. And the Bible was the first document ever, the first religious document ever that didn't require that one believe in lies. One didn't have to believe that Pharaoh could summon dragons, that Pharaoh was the son of the sun god himself. One could believe in a set of beliefs that made sense, that was congruent with nature. So when so super ironically, when the congregants at Chabad and Poway were celebrating the 8th day, the last day of Passover, that's actually the day that we sing in the Bible that we've seen Pharaoh for the last time. But in reality, the whole 20th century was a catalog of god-king pharaohs. Mao, Pol Pot, you mentioned Hitler, Stalin, the Assad family, the Kim family, Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. I could go on and on and on. These are folks that set themselves up as superpowers, almost gods. And essentially, their ideologies were God. Stalin, how else did Stalin force tens of millions of people into the Gulag, starve a quarter of the Ukraine, kill all the kulaks, and nobody said anything? Nobody resisted him because he was a god. He had his face projected by the Soviet Space Agency into the sky. How did Mao march millions of his comrades to their death? Murder maybe 30 million during the Cultural Revolution, and nobody said anything. We don't even have to talk about the current Assad Sun King, who's killing off his own countrymen at an alarming rate. There was never any resistance to this. Why? Because they used the same pageantry, the same poems, the same song, the same parades that were so seductive to Pharaoh's people and in Pharaoh's time, and to Sancherib and to all the folks we read about, all the despot god kings we read about in the Bible. And so what happens is that you have folks who are idolaters. They may be white supremacists, they may be racists in other ways. And one thing that an idolater always knows and is concerned that there's another bigger God. And the biggest God is the one God, the God we believe in, the God of the Bible. And so we end up being particular targets. But we end up doing so in a very strange way because the idolaters, these white supremacists and others, imagine our God to be like their God. They just imagine our God to be somebody bigger. That's why Jews, unlike other victims of racism, are not depicted as inferior people. Actually, Jews are depicted as somehow controlling the media, controlling the banks, controlling this, controlling that, having secret protocols of the elders of Zion. We're sort of made a reflection of racist idolatry is thrown onto the Jews, and so there's a need by the idolaters to eradicate the Jews, to eradicate God's people, to eradicate this other competing deity. And this other competing deity that we symbolize is the deity of the Bible, where all people, everyone, is a sister and a brother. There's nobody who's different. Mm-hmm. But if you're a god king, if you live in Egypt, well, you're part of the sun god Ramses or whoever, the pharaoh. And if you're a Hittite, you have a different god king, and your leader descends from that god king. We're not all descendants of the same one.
Scott, are you suggesting in any way that the attack, either in Pittsburgh or Poway, was the agency of some kind of formal power in America?
No, but what I am saying, and here's the punchline, is that where I think we're going to, and the reason I am so worried about these attacks, is it's a symbolism of modern idolatry. It's a symbolism that folks like this 19-year-old and like the fellow, I don't even want to mention their names, in Pittsburgh.
I don't either.
They became part of an idolatrous religion that said, we've got to end the Jews. And the fellow in Pittsburgh, he hated Trump because Trump likes the Jews. It's just about, in that case, the Jews. And
okay, there's one other, but I love the way you explain it. I have one, it's not even a problem. I just want you to clarify it from your own perspective. I also feel that in many ways, the Jew is the canary in the coal mine. I hope everybody understands that reference. If it happens to the Jew, it can happen to anybody. And in the coal mine,
but it happens to the Jew first.
Yes. If it happens to the canary in the coal mine, if the canary can't breathe, the people who are in that coal mine better get out as quickly as they can. Anyway, the Jew wasn't first here. The gay bar was first. Mm-hmm. Black churches were first. We have seen a rash of these murders over the last 10, 20 years. And they weren't about Jews. And I want to understand how that fits in, because what worries me, Scott, is that while I feel this is so horrendous, and as I said, our family now has to be careful because there are crazies, and I'm worried about copycats. But the notion that this is somehow directed at Jews discounts the fact that you and I have lived through, and we have mourned from afar, other kinds of mass murders that have gone on having nothing to do with Jews. The gay bar in Orlando had nothing to do with Jews. When they blow up a black church, it has nothing to do with Jews. And I'm afraid that the Jew now casts this as if, oh my, there is something happening peculiar to Jews, and it isn't.
So the Pharaoh and Hitler didn't just care about the Israelites. I mean, Pharaoh wanted to destroy the Hittites as well, and Hitler also wanted to destroy Rome, and he wanted to destroy a lot of other nations. But the difference between the Jewish anti-Semitism, what's unique about anti-Semitism, is that it's generally the anti-Semite wants to defeat the Jew because he somehow has this, or he or she has this view that the Jew is superior, is controlling things. I mean, we'll get to this hopefully later, the New York Times.
Yes, I do want to get to that.
Somehow the Jew is in control. Yeah. Whereas unfortunately, and the racism and the burning of the black churches, that is essentially coming from thinking that those victims are inferior and don't deserve to live, as opposed to, in many cases, being the same sort of competitive superior threat that people worry about with Jews.
Okay.
That's the difference.
If this were L'chaim, you and I would go
Yes.
on. We would discuss this in detail. Because it's a half hour, I can't do that. I will only say in passing, and I want we may talk about this a moment before you leave, and we may talk about this the next time we meet. What the Germans said about, what the Nazi said about the Jew was that he was worse than swine. He was not a human being. And so you have to explain to me how, even though I know there's this idea, as you said, this crazy Protocols of Zion, which was made up out of whole cloth. Yes, the Jews control everything. At the same time, the people who tend to beat up on Jews and murder Jews also try to say they aren't legitimate human beings. But we'll save that for 1 minute because I don't want...
It's a long and good conversation. I'd love to get into that.
We will. I want to hear your reaction to not one but two cartoons. There was a cartoon in the international edition of the New York Times which depicted Donald Trump as somebody blind being led by a guide dog. The guide dog had the face of Benjamin Netanyahu. It was outrageous. Bret Stephens was one of those who just castigated his own New York Times and said they don't understand what anti-Semitism is. It's not simply anti-Netanyahu and anti-Trump. And by the way, it's a very poor drawing of Netanyahu. And then the New York Times apologizes. And then Scott, the next day, there's another cartoon in the international edition of the New York Times, which is also just so offensive. It's Donald Trump as if he's Moses coming down with the Ten Commandments, and all he wants to do is take a selfie of himself. So I want to know what all this means to you. This is the liberal bastion. For us as Jews, the New York Times has been just one half rung below the Torah. Yeah. What's your sense of this, and what's your sense of where the left wing of the liberal American community is represented by the New York Times?
Well, I think that's an important question. I think the interesting thing about the fact that these were images is it sort of gave us a view of the subconscious of the New York Times. And this is the phenomena of these cartoons is, the first reaction was very interesting. I thought that was just so, when I read the first reaction, which was not an apology at all. It was, this is an internal, we really need to refer this to, internal audit. Certain procedures weren't followed, and regrettably, mistakes might have been made. But it was certainly not an apology. What the apology was once the uproar came, and then they were obviously very sorry that so many people were upset because they are a company. But I think the key is, again, the subconscious Grundgedanke, if you will, the ground think of the editing, which is just a few months ago, Alice Walker gave a report, gave an interview to one of the sections, the book review sections, and she referred in glowing terms, David Ickey's book, actually I don't even want to endorse that book, I'm not going to mention the name of the book, but in his book, he believes, totally incites the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, essentially says that the Jews are behind everything. And actually getting back to what you say, we're talking about denigration, and this is why we need a longer conversation. He actually thinks that reptile humans guide the world, and somehow the Jews have something to do with that. So he ties in the whole vermin issue. And this book is recommended in the New York Times by Alice Walker.
Yes.
Now, if anybody had recommended a book with a similar screed to refer to Muslims, Christians, Italians, Roma, I don't care who, sophomores, freshmen, whatever, it would never have appeared in the New York Times, and you got the exact same reaction that you got from the first. The New York Times response was the exact same as the first response they had to their cartoons, whereas, we're not endorsing this, we're not, this is just free speech, this is all good, we don't, we're showing, people's opinions. That would never, ever be permitted to be said about any other group, nor there would at least be some sort of editorial comment. You would never have any other group.
So what's it say to you, Scott?
So it says to me that given that throughout the pages of the New York Times, there's a certain ground think about approaching Jewish issues, that it's similar to what you alluded to in your opening, in that at certain universities, unless you are not, certainly you can't be pro-Zionist to get tenure. You have to keep your head down. You have to follow the party line and do what the party line requires. To step out of that party line, I mean, there are basically two editors at the Times that don't have the party line, and that's Bret Stephens, who you mentioned, and Barry Weiss. And even reading the most recent Vanity Fair review of Barry Weiss, she's clearly an outsider. People don't even include her in sort of the ground think conversations that take place at the Times. They're sort of the guest visiting professor.
They're the token
conservatives.
They're the token.
Yeah.
I only have about a minute left. Scott, for you, what is more frightening to you? The anti-Semitism that's on the right or the anti-Semitism that's on the left?
So again, to me, it comes down to idolatry. They both scare the daylights out of me. I remember the story of my father telling me in Svexner's, they were deporting the Jews and murdering other Jews, how the locals just stood around and watched. That scares the living daylights out of me. And then I watch what's going on with SJP, where folks are talking literally about that there shouldn't be any Jews in the Middle East. And saying that essentially the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures are all a bunch of bunk. They both scare the living daylights out of me, and that's why I'm so worried about what I think is this new idolatry that is starting to arise. And I think we have to combat it with equal fervor on both sides. I really get upset when I talk to some friends who say, to tell me that, we've got to be much more worried about the right because they're actually murdering Jews, but on the left we don't, and vice versa. I think we have to deal with both, and I think it's our responsibility as Jews to deal with both because, again, we believe in one God. We're all brothers and sisters, and we have to figure out a way to be a unifying force and not start aligning on one side or the other.
You are fabulous.
Thank you.
I love it when you're on L'chaim. You must always make yourself available to comment on the issues of the day. Scott, you're a very important voice in our Jewish world today, and I am so grateful and I'm honored that you go out of your way to make sure you are here on JBS. Thank you, my friend.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Mark.
Thank you. Scott Shay, author of In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism. By the way, if you didn't see him on L'chaim here on JBS, go to the JBS website, jbstv.org, and go to the L'chaim page, and you can scroll down and find my conversation with Scott. It's out of this world, and many people have just raved about both that discussion and the book, In Good Faith. As always, my thanks to all of those who helped make this edition of In the News possible. But I want to specifically invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or your own response to my own comments or to those you've heard from Scott Shay. And the best way to reach me is email at rabbigolub@jbstv.org. Very simple, rabbigolub@jbstv.org. My thanks to our director on this edition of In the News, Dara Golub, as well as Michael Paley and John McDevitt, and to the producers of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal and Tisha Bader. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.